is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording, Cat Pianos, Sound Houses, and Other Imaginary Musical Instruments by Thomas Patson and Deirdre Lawridge, published July 15th, 2015, read by a Trident Disabilities volunteer. Deirdre Lawridge and Thomas Patson, curators of the Museum of Imaginary Musical Instruments, explore the wonderful history of made-up musical contraptions, including a piano comprised of yelping cats and Francis Bacon's 17th century vision of experimental sound manipulation. Following this is an image of a temple-like structure with multiple spikes and columns running around the bottom and swirls and shapes and circles at the top. The caption for this reads, Robert Flood's Temple of Music, one of the great 17th century oculist contribution to the domain of speculative technology, from his Eucharistic Cosme, 1617. And as the instruments of the hand either give motion or guide it, so the instruments of the mind supply either suggestions for the understanding or cautions. Francis Bacon. Numerous museums are dedicated to musical instruments. In Berlin and Brussels, Paris and Phoenix, one can wander rooms lined with musical artifacts from many times and places. Strolling through these rooms, one might admire the exquisite craftsmanship of a Stradivarius violin or the opulent artistry of a French harpsichord. One might linger over forgotten curiosities like the tromba marina or a board of experiments like Otto Sachs' seven-bell horn. One's path might follow changes in the instrumentarium from Renaissance woods and metals to modern plastics and electronics, and the experience might lead one to wonder at the diversity of species born from the physics of vibrating strings, air columns, and resonating bodies. Missing from such collections, however, is the peculiar class of what we like to call fictophones, imaginary musical instruments. Though these instruments, due to some measure of impracticality and impossibility, did not take sounding form, they were nonetheless put forth in the various means available to conjure objects in our mind, in writings, drawings, and sometimes even detailed schematics. One might suppose that imaginary musical instruments, deprived of physical reality, have no place in the cultural histories and heritages that the Museum of Musical Instruments aims to illuminate and preserve. Yet in their strange ways, imaginary musical instruments exist. What's more, they do not have merely shadowed or paralleled music life. They have formed a vital part of it, participating in ways that show the fragility of this distinction between imaginary and real. No less than instruments you hold in your hand, imaginary instruments act as interfaces between mind and world, limiting the edges of what we may think and do. Below this is an image of a machine made with two humps at the top and two sets of windpipes, one of which is being played by a creature at the top. Two birds follow, with strings leading down to a column of air with holes in it. The caption for this reads, a fantastical musical machine as imagined by Anthemius Kircher in his Mersurgia Universalis, 1650. Kircher would also write about the cat piano. Take, for starters, Francis Bacon's sound houses. Bacon described these spaces for manipulating sound in his New Atlantis, 1626, a utopian work in which a European traveler lost at sea happens upon a society living on the mythical island of Bensalem. The sound houses represent the acoustic branch of Bensalem's state-sponsored research program, which seeks both to produce knowledge on how nature works and to translate that knowledge into real-world applications for human benefit. In the following passage, the director of Bensalem's scientific endeavors explains to his foreign guest. We have also sound houses, where we practice and demonstrate all sounds in their generation. We have harmonies, which you have not, of quarter sounds and lesser slides of sounds. Divers instruments of music likewise to you unknown, some sweeter than you any have, together with bells and rings that are dainty and sweet. We represent small sounds as great and deep, likewise great sounds extuent and sharp. We make divers tremble and warblings of sounds, which in their original are entire. We represent and imitate all articulate sounds and letters, and the voices and notes of beasts and birds. We have certain helps which set to the ear do further the hearing greatly. We also have the divers strange and artificial echoes, reflecting the voice many times, and as it were tossing it, and some that give it back the voice louder than it came, some shriller and some deeper. Yeah, some rendering the voice differing in the letters or articulate sound from which they receive. We have also means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes, in strange lines and distances. Bacon's sound houses are hypothetical, and exercise in imagining what could be. Many readers today find them prophetic, and it is tempting to read the line about divers instruments of music likewise to you unknown, as if its author had a foreknowledge of synthesizers and tape. But to read the sound houses in this way displaces them from their own time, and the experiments with pipes, bells, and string instruments from which Bacon extrapolated. By reducing their role to one of prediction, furthermore, it sets the imaginary at a powerless remove from the real. Rather than prophetic, Bacon's sound houses are emblematic of the power of imaginary instruments to act upon the world, of the magnet-like force they exert, attracting or repelling certain modes of thought and action. One of the first to explore the musical possibilities of electronic instruments, Daphne Oram, was familiar with Bacon's New Alienus. In 1958, she posted the passage about sound houses on the door of the Radiophonic Workshop, the newly founded department within the BBC dedicated to electronic music, which she helped establish. At this early moment in electronic music, it was far from clear what techniques and sounds would prove valuable, what aspects of past musical practice could translate. Oram's invocation of Bacon's sound houses suggests that such moments create openings for the imaginary to flood in, not just from the creative minds of individuals, but from a collective storehouse of fantasies. Imaginary instruments help ideas circulate together with the desire for or fear of their realization. As Bacon himself observed, instruments of the mind supply either suggestions for the understanding of cautions. Bacon's sound houses illustrate one's era technology imaginary, becoming a later one's reality. The course of things we likely expect, but the process can run the other way sound as well. The tubo cochleo, for example, was described by Athanasius Kircher in his Treatise of Acoustics, Phonergia Nova, 1673, as a device for amplifying the voice. Kircher's student Filippo Bonanni also discussed the device in his book, Gabinetto Armonico Pieno di Instrumenti Sonori Indicati e Spiegati. Musical cabinet full of sounding instruments, shown and explained, 1722, where it appears among musical instruments both of common European use and from other parts of the world. As Bonanni explained, the tubo cochleo would amplify the voice much more than a straight tube. The evidence came from nature, from the fact that ears of hares and other timid animals were formed in a spiral shape. But since it was extremely difficult for man to make a spiral so perfectly as nature, it was near impossible to construct the tubo cochleo, and no one in Bonanni's day used the device. Below this is an example of someone using the Bonanni cochleo device, and a swirl and tube connecting, similar to a French horn. The caption for this reads, image from Filippo Bonanni's Gabinetto Armonico, 1723. In fact, the tubo cochleo was purely speculative, but only in light of later theories of sound propagation would the design appear fundamentally flawed, the concept out of line with basic physics in addition to human craftsmanship. For Kircher and Bonanni, the instrument was real. Kircher's reality, indeed, included many things we would consider fantastic. Dragons, for instance, as John Glassy had discussed. As a measure of the gap between our reality and Kircher's, the tubo cochleo, like the dragon, attests to the power of research and experiment to debunk the famous. At the same time, perhaps more discerningly, Bonanni's book reveals the power of images and text to define the real through a blend of speculative and empirical elements. Similarly, hovering between the speculative and empirical is a curious device known as the cat piano. The earliest known image of a set of cats arranged as sound-producing elements to be activated by the fingers date to the late 16th century, that is, over 100 years before the invention of the piano, at a time when it would more properly be called a cat harpsichord or clavichord. The image comes from an emblem book, Johann Theodor de Bry's, emblemata, secluria, mira et incunita, varietate saeculi huius, mores idem experimenta, ut satellitium symbolis, 1596, and shows a motley ensemble of animals and confused musicians. A subtitle to the scene, "There is no music sweeter to Meta's ears," alludes to the Phrygian king whose punishment for preferring Pan's pipe to Apollo's lyre was to have his ears turned into those of a donkey. Below this is an image of the cat piano with plenty of animals and people around. Two of the people have banjos and guitar-like instruments, while the other is playing the piano, appearing to have many notes and the heads of possums or cats poking out of the piano. The caption for this reads, "First known image of the cat piano from Johann Theodor de Bry's Emblemata, 1596, courtesy of Robert J. Richards." From a comical image of cacophony, the cat piano underwent a series of unexpected functional transformations. By the 1650s, it was a legendary music therapy. Supposedly, an Italian prince was cured of his melancholy by the device when he found its meowing cats, triggered by driving spikes through their tails, irresistibly funny. The early 19th century medical theorist Johann Christian Rau offered a different account of the cat piano's therapeutic powers. In his treatise on psychological cures for the mentally disturbed, Rhapsodium über die Erwindung der physischen Krankheit auf Geistesverkehr, 1803, he presented the cat piano as a hypothetical fix for dreamers unable to focus attention on the external world. As he vividly explained, the cats would be arranged in a row with their tails stretched behind them, and a keyboard fitted out with sharpened nails would be set over them. The struck cats would provide the sound, a fugue played on his instrument, when the ill person is so placed that he cannot miss the expressions on their faces, and the play of these animals must bring Lot's wife herself from her fixed state into conscious awareness. In yet another thought experiment with the instrument, the 18th century Parisian Louis Bertrand Castel invoked it to prove his convention on what mattered in music was a combination of sounds, not sounds in their own right. The fact that one could make music from the individually ugly plaints of pained cats proved that sounds on their own possess no beauty, and that all the beauties of music come not from sound, but from the melodic sequence and the harmonic combination of these sounds, multiplied and varied in portion. Below this is two images of the cat piano, the first one in much older version, and it describes as the cat piano or cats and clavier, as depicted in Gaspar Schott's Magia Universalis Natura et Artis. The image contains mewling cats and the keys of a piano connected to them. The image below this is an illustration of the cat piano from Nature Volume 11, 1883, and contains a much more tame version, with the cats each in a clear see-through box at the end of the piano facing outwards, with the keys in the back facing backwards. The absurdity of a cat piano has no doubt contributed to its appeal across the centuries, but the license granted in the space of the imaginary points to illicit aspects of the real. The cat piano unearths an uncomfortable connection between music and abuse, between the artistic control of sound and the heartless treatment of sounding bodies. Both artistic control and the heartless treatment are embedded to the keyboard interface, which gives players access to numerous pitches but only at a remove from their source. That keyboards facilitate cruelty is a notion hardly evident in the history of realized instruments. A rare hint is found on an 18th century spinet inscribed "Intactum cilio percute dulce cano." Untouched, I am silent. Strike me, I sing sweetly. But it is front and center in the history of imaginary instruments. Jules Verne demonstrates the connection by substituting humans for cats in his short story, Médéri's et Mille Midol, Mr. Ray Sharp and Miss Me Flat, 1893. A musician outfits an organ with a special register of humans' voices. From the perspective of the child assisted to the pitch D sharp or Re sharp in solfege, we learn the appalling truth. Then an air current inflates my chest, a current skillfully controlled, which carries the Re sharp out of my lips. I want to be silent, but I cannot. I am nothing but an instrument in the organist's hands. His touch upon the keyboard is like a valve opening my heart. The keyboard finds yet a more sadistic form of species of organ in the film The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, 1988, called the Torturium. The instrument sends spikes into people's sides so as to add their moans to the tones of a more conventional rank of pipes. Below this is an illustration of George's Row from the first edition of Jules Verne's Here de Domaine, 1910, and it features one person playing the piano with many people in the back crowded around and whispering. Verne's organ and the Torturtron exemplify the capacity of imaginary instruments to serve as cautions we would do well to heed in this age when so much of what we do takes place through keyboards and other interfaces that remove us from the carrying out of our commands. The note of warning is one imaginary instruments have sounded with growing regularity since the 19th century, as the wonders of new technologies have stroked fears about their consequences for humanity. Amidst the rise of industrial machinery, for example, the French caricaturist J.J. Granville envisioned a fantastic steam concert of intelligent steam-powered instruments. The program described in his book Un autre monde, 1844, features such pieces as L'Explosion Melody pour 200 trombones, The Explosion, a Melody for 200 trombones, and La Locomotive Symphonie à basse pression de l'Orse de trop 100 chevaux. The Locomotive, a low-pressure symphony with 200 horsepower, and the Moi et non moi Symphonie Philosophie en ut, the Self and the Non-Self, Philosophical Symphony in C. At once fascinating and disturbing, Granville's anthropomorphic instruments express a fundamental ambivalence about the development of increasingly powerful and autonomous technologies. Below this is an illustration from J.J. Granville's Un autre monde, 1844, featuring a series of bands, each one playing a different instrument, with shadows for faces, all smiling gleefully. Ask any good Frenchman what he understands by progress, Charles Baudelaire observed in 1855. He will tell you that it is steam, electricity, and gas lighting. Today one might say that what we understand by progress is digital networks, mind-machine interfaces, and biotechnologies. These have been prime stimuli to 20th and 21st century inventions of imaginary instruments such as Pat Cadigan, who detailed brain sockets for music, video, and production, in the cyberpunk novel Sinners, 1991, and Richard Powers, whose Orfeo, 2014, envisioned music encoded in DNA. Granville, Cadigan, and Powers illustrate not only a cautionary strand in imaginary instrument design, but also a distinct temporal orientation. Each places his or her inventions on the not-too-distant future. In the history of imaginary musical instruments, the emergence of a futuristic orientation can be dated back quite precisely. The turning point occurs with Louis Sebastian Mercier's novel, L'An 2440, the year 2440, published in 1771. The utopian premise of the novel is reminiscent of Bacon's New Atlantis. Here, too, an outsider encounters a society where experimental research is undertaken for the benefit of mankind. In the field of acoustics, a device made of springs is capable of imitating all manners of sounds, and is used to dissuade the king from going to war by letting him hear the horrors and grief it would cause. But where Bacon's sound horses were found in a contemporaneous foreign land, Mercier's springs exist in their author's home city, 700 years in the future, Paris 2440. The novel, generally considered the first significant example of fiction set in the future, promptly inspired other futurological visions, such as the fantastic image of a 25th century postal balloon shown below, which would deliver mail via the air and have a pipe organ built into its bows. Below this is the image of the postal balloon, with a rooster at the top holding a flag and directing. This reads, print by Balsalier, Anton Dunker, probably dating to 1784, depicting the 25th century postal balloon. The imagination is often figured as a site of infinite possibility, free to create without regard to material limitations. But touring the Museum of Imaginary Musical Instruments suggests that there are in fact certain grooves that form over time to channel the course of fantasy. Futuristic imaginary instruments flow along one such groove. The future orientation of the imagination directs its energies to the technologies synonymous with progress in the present, an effect that starts to show its peculiar limitations when one looks back at projections like the hot air balloon of 2440. This particular channel for technological fantasy was not always so deep. Before the 18th century, imaginary instruments typically appeared either in contemporaneous foreign land, like Bacon's sound houses, or in the past as devices that existed but had been lost, like the tubo cochleatum. The Museum of Imaginary Musical Instruments thus illuminates not only the intersection of reality and fantasy, but also the unknown history of the imagination. It reveals numerous paths of inventive thought not taken, paths covered up by years of progress, but which, when cleared off, might yet lead us back to something new.